All right, so up to this point, we've been looking at read-only, right? Retrieving data from database. Let's talk about being able to update, meaning we like to be able to insert, update, delete, make changes to the data, right? As opposed to just read the data. And again, from our RESTful services. First, let's look at creating brand new data. So following the RESTful naming conventions, to create, we're always going to use a post, right? And also we're posting to the right URL /users. That is the entity we're posting to. And just like we've been using for the last week or so, we are parsing the user instance from the HTTP body, right? From the JSON that presumably is embedded in the HTTP request. So to insert into a database is fairly simple, right? The CRUD repository that we're extending, right, already declares a function that allows us to save, right, to insert into the database. So it's the .save. We're saying user repository .save, right, and we're going to insert into the database, right. Now this .save is smart enough to know whether this object already exists in the database. Right, so the first thing that I'll check to see if there's is this instance already in there in the database? Is there a primary key already in there? If there is, it'll do an update instead, right? If it's not already in the database, it'll do an insert. If it's already in the database, it'll do an update, okay, and it'll update the fields that it needs to update. So here it's a brand new instance, and so it'll do an insert. So here's an example of testing our API here. We're passing username and password, first name and last name, and it's returning an instance that has been inserted to the database because it has the ID equal to 7. Right? This was automatically generated by the JPA once it was inserted into a database. For update, so the update assumes that the record already exists, right? There's already a record in there, has a primary key, is already storing in the database. So for update, what we need to do is first find the record that we want to update, right? So retrieve that with the primary key. Once that object it lives now in memory, that object is now referred to as a managed object, right? Notice what we're doing here. We're saying user repository dot find by ID. Okay, we're getting it, and now we have it in memory, that user instance. See that? That user instance is not just any user instance. Okay? Even though it has the class user, it's not your user class. Okay? It's a class that has the same name. It behaves identical to your user class, and you wouldn't know it unless I told you that this is not your user class. Okay? It's an on-the-fly class that is generated by JPA, right, to behave just like your class, but it's designed to be able to be aware of any changes that happen to this instance, right? If you call a set on this instance, right, it will flag as a user being as a record being dirty. Something changed. The state of this object just changed. And that means that whatever I have in memory is not synchronized with the database, right? So I have a dirty object in memory, and I need to synchronize, right? I need to be able to store this back into the database, right? Okay. So in this case, we are calling a function inside of our class, which I called it set. Right, and set, what it's going to do is just going to do a copy of the fields. Right, it's going to take the first name from the new user. It's just going to copy first name to first name, last name to last name. It's going to just make changes to the state. Right, now the dot save here. This dot save is going to do an update instead of an insert because it knows that user is a managed object. This is not a brand new instance that was passed in. If I would have said a dot save new user that is coming through HTTP, then it would have been an insert. Right? But because I am doing a dot save on a managed object, it doesn't do an insert, it does an update. So this is an entity that has a mapping to an actual record in the database, okay? And you're just manipulating some of the fields. It also smart enough to know that you only change one field but not the other, so that when it does an update, it only updates the field that actually was modified, and it won't touch all the other fields. Okay, so it's smart enough to do targeted updates. Okay. So yeah, set name is just a method inside the user class that just takes a source object and just copies the fields over to the target object. So here's an example of just changing the first name to Tim, and it does an update in the database. And finally, we have delete. Notice that we're using the correct RESTful service with taking the path, and from the path we're taking the user ID, and the repository, the CRUD repository from where we are inheriting, implements a delete by ID, just like there's a find by ID, find all. It also implements a delete by ID. If you give it a primary key, it will go out and remove the record from the database, right? And it does user repository. You could just from Postman, you can send a delete to that URL, and it'll remove it from the record.